Keon, a senior research analyst with Thomson Reuters Lipper. I'm here to speak to you about the fund flows activity for the week ended Wednesday, September 20th. We'll start the report by taking a quick look at the market activity. Both the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 Index were up for the week. The Dow gained approximately 1.15%, while the S&P was up 0.4%. This brings their year-to-date gains to 13.4% and 12%, respectively. And the big news for the week came out of the Federal Reserve two-day policy meeting, where they announced that they are leaving rates unchanged for now, but they do anticipate one more interest rate hike before the end of the year. This news of the impending hike comes despite the fact that we're still continuing to see weak inflation data. The Fed also announced that they would start unwinding their $4.5 trillion balance sheet pretty soon in October in a gradual and predictable manner. Okay, let's move back now to our fund flows activity. Take a look at that now. We'll start by looking at the macro fund groups, what they did for the week. Equity mutual funds saw outflows of $2.3 billion. Taxable bond funds took in net new money of $5.3 billion. Muni bond funds had positive net inflows of $547 million, while money market funds saw $18.2 billion leave their coffers. Let's take a closer look at each fund macro group now. We'll start with our equity funds group. Looking at the mutual funds, the $2.3 billion in outflows we mentioned was a 13th straight weekly net outflow for the group. Continuing the long-term trend, domestic equity mutual funds were responsible for all the outflows this week, as they saw $4 billion leave their coffers, while non-domestic equity funds took in about $1.7 billion in net new money. If we break this down, taking a closer look at the peer groups, the largest net inflow for the non-domestic equity fund group belonged to the International Multi-Cap Core Fund peer group, which had about $500 million in positive flows this week, while on the flip side, for the domestic equity funds, the largest outflow belonged to the Large Cap Growth Funds peer group, which saw just over $1 billion leave their coffers. Let's move on to the equity ETF group now. This group actually had net inflows for the week. They took in $3.1 billion in net new money for their fourth straight weekly inflows. The major contributors to the last week's net inflows was the iShares Russell 2000 ETF, which had net inflows of roughly $2 billion, and the PowerShares QQQ, which took in about $740 million in net new money. And on the other side of the coin, we see the SPDR S&P 500 with net outflows of about $4.3 billion last week. Moving on to our next set of funds, we'll take a look at the taxable bond fund group, starting with mutual funds. This group had net inflows of $5.3 billion last week. This pushes their year-to-date net inflow to $133 billion, which is on pace for the highest annual net inflow since 2012, when the group took in $257 billion. The major contributors to this week's net inflows was the leader was the Core Plus Bond Funds peer group, which had net inflows of just over $800 million, followed by the Core Bond Funds group, which had positive flows of about $782 million. Moving on to taxable bond ETFs now. Net inflows for this group again last week. They took in $1.8 billion, their 11th straight weekly net inflow. This pushes their year-to-date net inflow to $85 billion. The previous high for the group was roughly $75 billion, which they took in last year, so they're on pace for their highest annual net inflow ever. The largest contributors last week was the iShares 20-plus year Treasury product, which had net inflows of just about $730 million, and the SPDR Bloomberg Barclays High Yield product took in $353 million in net new money. Moving on now, we'll take a look at our Muni Bond Fund group. This group had net inflows also last week. They took in $547 million in net new money for their 11th straight weekly net inflow. The big players last week was the Short Muni Debt Fund peer group, as well as the High Yield Muni Debt Fund peer group, which had net inflows of $195 million and $140 million respectively. Our last group to take a look at now is money market funds. And kind of a reverse of the trend, the large inflows we've been seeing into the group. We've seen some money leave in 2 out of the last 4 weeks, I believe, including this week. had about $18.2 billion in net outflows for the group this week, mostly coming from the institutional U.S. government money market fund peer group, as well as the institutional U.S. Treasury money market fund group, which had about $14.2 billion and $5.1 billion leave respectively. Well, that wraps up this week's report. If you'd like to take a closer look at the data yourself, please join us at our website, which is www.lipperusfundflows.com. And please join us here again next week, where another one of our analysts will be speaking about that week's fund flows activity.